All right, welcome back to another session of the online Peace Science Colloquium. If you're tuning in for the first time, I'm Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. I co-run this colloquium with Chelsea S. Ancona, who's an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. If this is your first time tuning in, we are affiliated with the Peace Science Society International, and the goal of this colloquium is to continue sharing and improving and giving feedback on the great kind of research that happens at each year's annual meeting of the Peace Science Society. So this is going to be our final session for the spring 2023 semester, and we're really excited to have a presentation from Zoe Ge, who is a recent recipient of a PhD from NYU. Zoe just defended a couple of weeks ago, so let's give a hand for Zoe. Congratulations. She's going to be presenting a really cool paper called "Empowered by Information: Disease Outbreak Reporting at the World Health Organization." And so we have joining us an excellent discussant. We have Lindsay Dolan from Wesleyan University. So with that, Zoe, I'll turn the floor over to you, and we'll see a presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brad, for the nice introduction, and thank you for the opportunity for me to present my work here. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, great. Can everyone? No, let me enter full screen. Okay, is it working? I assume it is. Okay,
yes, we
good.
can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, hello everyone. I'm really excited to present this work. Today we're going to talk about public health, and I have a good news for everyone. It's not working. Okay, last week the WHO declared the end of COVID outbreak as a global health pandemic emergency. So this is really good. It's a monumental moment for the past 3 years. But if we look into human history, this is not the first time that we are faced with such a big pandemic. 20 years ago, there's another outbreak called the SARS, which was also originated in China. And if we compare these two outbreaks, we find something really interesting about the Chinese government. 20 years ago, when the WHO sent an investigation team to China to investigate the outbreak, the Chinese government barred the WHO experts from the original site of illness in an attempt to conceal the outbreak and avoid the costly trade and the travel bans. 20 years later, during the COVID outbreak, the Chinese government reported very early on about the disease outbreaks at the end of 2019. And the WHO has been praising Chinese government for being cooperative. Why did China respond slowly to SARS but quickly to COVID? Today, I'm going to give you an answer based on an institutional change at the World Health Organization. This change is called the International Health Regulations Reform, which started in 2005 and was mostly motivated by the SARS outbreak. One of the key changes in the reform is that it authorized the WHO to disseminate outbreak information to the international community without waiting for states to confirm first. And I argue that it is because of this change that the Chinese government changed their behavior. However, as we all know, states do not always comply with their obligations under international treaties. And this is especially true for the WHO, which doesn't have an army of doctors to send to the outbreak country to help deal with the outbreaks, nor does the WHO has any punishment mechanism to sanction countries for not being cooperative. Why then can such a toothless international organization make states share information? And I argue that information dissemination can induce cooperation. This is because information triggers outbreak responses from the international community, which can take the form of resources. We see that the Doctors Without Borders are always the first to be on the front line to help heal the patients. Political leaders send aid to outbreak countries to help deal with the outbreaks. In addition to resources, the international community may also respond by imposing trade and travel restrictions. We see that during the COVID, when the international community become aware of the characteristics of the Omicron variant, a lot of trade and travel restrictions were imposed on African lead countries, even in those countries who do not have the Omicron variant back then. Not only states, even universities might tighten their travel rules to prevent the virus from coming to their campus. And I argue that these responses can deter disease concealment. Now let's take a look at the comparison between SARS and the COVID. During the SARS outbreak, the Chinese government knew that the WHO cannot really do anything if they did not allow the WHO to tell the community about the outbreak. Therefore, the Chinese government concealed the outbreak to the maximum level they can to avoid or delay the border restrictions. However, during COVID, the Chinese government understood that even if they do not cooperate with the WHO can still let the community know about outbreak, and they cannot really avoid the trade and the travel restrictions. Therefore, the Chinese government decided to report in the first place, which allows them to control what information goes to the WHO's information dissemination. There's another layer in my argument. I argue that there's heterogeneous effect of information dissemination. This is because information can trigger heterogeneous responses. I argue that if a country is highly integrated with the global system, this country is going to receive lots of help during disease outbreaks and face fewer bans from the international community. Knowing such heterogeneous responses, now we can take a look at the effect of the reform and understand who are concealing and who become more cooperative after the reform. So before the reform, the WHO can do nothing with the states. Therefore, for states that are deeply integrated into the international system, they want to report the outbreaks to the WHO so that the WHO will let everyone know about it, and the friends of these countries can give help. So it's in their interest to report and get help from the international community. For countries with shallow integration with the international system, they are facing a very different trade-off. What they are seeing is that they know if there's something with within their territory, and when the international community become aware of that, then these people will just close their borders to prevent the disaster coming to their territory. Therefore, the countries with shallow integration with the global system want to conceal the outbreak so that they can avoid the costly border restrictions. What changed after the reform is that the WHO can use information to trigger border restrictions, and the bans are kind of costly for the countries to their economy and the daily operation of all kinds of activities. Therefore, the WHO gained some punishment capacity, and therefore, for countries with shallow integration with the global system, they understand that they cannot really conceal the outbreak. Therefore, they become more forthcoming with the outbreaks. Therefore, countries with shallow integration report after the reform. While for countries with deeper integration, it's always in their interest to report and get help from everyone. This gives us the hypothesis: the international health regulations reform increase the reporting from states with shallow integration with the international community. Moving on the test, I'm looking at this website called Disease Outbreak News, and the picture on the left is what the website looks like when the pandemic just hit, and they updated the website since COVID. And this is one of the WHO's most important information dissemination platform. And it is also one of the most frequently visited web page. I argue that the number of reports can be an indicator of states' cooperation with outbreak reporting. Why is that the case? So the WHO has an information verification system. This is what the system looks like before the IHR reform. As a public health expert, the WHO has its intelligence system, which surveils news articles around the world to detect dubious events. And every day, an outbreak verification team read the reports and decide if there's something important to the international public health. If they find something important, they have to proceed and verify with the outbreak state. It is only when the outbreak is confirmed by the state can the WHO post a report on their website. And what changed after the reform is that this confirmation stage is taken away, which means before the reform, we can only see reports that are confirmed by the state in the data set. And after the reform, this missing portion of reports is recovered into the data set. Therefore, the number of DANS reports can be a good indicator of states' cooperation level. After scraping this website and aggregate them to the country year level, I get a sample of 152 countries ranging from 1996 to 2015. To measure a country's integration with the international community, I take two steps. First, I treated the US as the center of the international community because US actions are often coordinated with its allies, and these countries in combination has the greatest influence in the international community. So it is a good summary of what a country is going to receive upon disease outbreaks based on this country's integration with the US. I create 3 different dimensions. For the political dimension, I'm using the ideal point distance based on the UNGA voting records with the US. For the economic dimension, I'm using a country's imports from the US. For the geographic dimension, I use the total number of seats on direct flights to the US. I create an integration Z-score index, which is the average of the standardized score of these 3 different dimensions. Of course, the US is not the center of the international community. What I did next is that I expanded the center to several different powerful countries in the world. And of course, the first group of countries are major Western powers such as UK, France, and Germany. And the second group of countries is China and Russia. They are increasingly important in the international arena. My empirical strategy uses a diff setting. My dependent variable is the total number of DANS reports. And I created this graph to help illustrate the coefficient of the regression. So beta 1 is the coefficient for the integration term. It captures the difference in reporting between integrated and isolated states. And we should expect beta 1 to be positive to get the idea that isolated states are concealing. Post is the post-reform indicator, which is year 2005. Beta 2 captures the coefficient of this interaction term. So after the reform, the gap in reporting between integrated and isolated countries become beta 1 plus beta 2. Our hypothesis argued that isolated states reports more after the IHR reform, which means the gap in reporting should be smaller, which means beta 2 should be negative. Okay, here is the result. We see that across different specifications, the coefficient of the interaction term are consistently negative, suggesting that after the IHR reform, isolated states reported more. To check the mechanism, we know that there are different types of diseases. Some diseases are more relevant, some are not. We know that if a disease is highly transmissible and if the disease does not have an effective vaccine, this would be a very important disease that the international community would be willing to react to. However, we don't have a really good measure for these 2 dimensions. What I did is that I'm looking at the CDC webpage called the Travelers Health webpage. The website has a disease directory of diseases related to international travel. I'm treating this group of diseases as the travel-related and the rest as the other diseases. After recategorize different reports and aggregate them to the country year level, this is what I find. I find that the first column is the coefficient estimate for the interaction term for the travel-related diseases. And we find that isolated countries are reporting more after the IHR reform for travel-related diseases, but the same effect does it disappeared for the rest of the diseases. This means this supported our mechanism that the countries reporting cooperative behavior comes from a third-party enforcement mechanism. Therefore, we should not be able to see any result for the rest of the diseases. So moving on to the next, is this really about the US? What I did here is that I expanded the center of the international community to different countries. And here I'm showing you the result related to the UNGA voting similarity. And the first 4 column shows that shows the negative coefficient estimate for a country's integration with Western major powers that suggests that for countries who are isolated from Western major powers, these countries become more cooperative with the reporting. However, for countries who are close to China or Russia, the last 2 columns shows that these countries become more cooperative. So this set of results seems to suggest that the reform has a greater constraining power over non-allies of Western powers. And this kind of shows us some indirect influence of the powerful countries in international organizations by delegating some more information authority to the neutral IO. Powerful actors in the international organization can get not their friends to cooperate more. So to conclude, I argue that information empowers the WHO at the cost of politicization. We do see from the result that we have deeper cooperation after the IHR reform. We can see that from China's early response to the COVID outbreak. However, this comes at a cost. We also find that there's a heterogeneity in the result. The cooperation comes specifically from non-allies of Western powers. This suggests that if we delegate more information authority to a neutral IO, that actually gives powerful actors more influence over more influence. And this suggests that kind of explains why we see greater politicization at the WHO, because the cooperation, the effect of the reform is targeted towards countries based on their political dimension. And this also explains why we see so many criticism against the WHO for being corruptive with the Chinese government. In response to these kinds of criticism, the Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, responded with this quote: "It is wrong to be any country-centric. I am sure we are not China-centric. The truth is, if we're going to be blamed, it is right to blame us for being US-centric." Remember, the Director General is the agent of 200 bosses. They cannot really publicly saying that we're working for this boss specifically, but the reason why he said this sentence is that there is some indirect influence that the international system granted to the US and its allies. And my paper illustrates the underlying logic behind this sentence. I think that's it. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the comments.
Awesome. Thanks, Zoe. So before we get to Lindsay's comments, Zoe, I'll ask you to take just a couple of minutes, and if you could contextualize the project for us, just to kind of help us, see what kind of feedback would be most useful for you at this stage.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I want to send this out soon because I want to have some change on my CV. So, but I think I will have probably lots of changes after the review process. So I think any comments would be useful, especially for if the model is clear, if you think there's an alternative explanation, and if the empirical test has some other things you think that would be useful to do, those are all super welcome. And also I'm going to do a book project based on the current one. So if you think there are things that would be super interesting to include to the book project, that would be super nice to have.
Okay, great. Thanks, Zoe. So with that, I'll get out of the way and let Lindsay take over. So Lindsay, if you want to take 10 minutes or however long you feel like it would take to kind of hit all the high points of the discussion, then we'll return to Zoe, let her respond, and then we'll just have a conversation with the rest of our time.
That sounds great.
The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Zoe, for this really interesting paper. I think to anybody who is reading this paper, I think this is a really great example of a job market paper. I think it holds together so nicely. It's a really nice illustration too of how you can use a formal model to support a theory and then design an empirical strategy that is, very sensitive to the role of causality, very sensitive to the kinds of data that you're using, that directly tests the expectations of that model. And I think that is something that is just worth highlighting. And I think we'll have a lot of success as it's going out as a paper for review. And also, there are so many interesting questions that come out of this that are really policy relevant, that are relevant for understanding the politics of what's going on with COVID. I think there's not a ton of great work in this space. And so I think that you have the chance to make a really impactful contribution here. And I think that there's a lot you could explore in a book. So I'm really glad to hear that that is a direction that you were thinking about. Most of my comments, I think, relate to, sort of potential extensions that you could do in complementary chapters that might fit into a book, or maybe could be addressed as potential alternative explanations in a more abbreviated way in this manuscript if they end up coming up in the review process. So most of my comments actually have to do most of my comments center on understanding the impact of this IHR reform and thinking about actually a different cooperation problem than the one that you describe in your paper. So the cooperation problem you describe in your paper is the one that exists between the World Health Organization and outbreak states and getting outbreak states to report information. My impression is that there is another cooperation problem that goes on with respect to the WHO, which is the cooperation between the WHO and other countries who don't have outbreaks going on. So here's my impression of what goes on is that countries around the world might be a little bit trigger happy. They might want to trigger these restrictions to prevent disease from getting into their country. And so they have an instinct to be a little bit more protective of their borders. And the WHO is aware that that's what these neighboring countries are incentivized to do and says, no, don't do that. We don't want you to overreact to this crisis. We want you to just hang on, wait until we tell you that a ban or a restriction is appropriate. And in doing that, they do that specifically to lessen the costs that outbreak states pay when they do share information, because the WHO wants to encourage them to share as much information as possible. And so I think that the other half of the story of what's going on here is that the WHO kind of serves as this go-between of trying to create conditions that actually encourage states to provide that information without facing excessive punishment. So that is the sort of other side of the cooperation problem that I see going on with your story. I also, just from reading Catherine Warsnop's work, I also get the impression that that the WHO is not particularly successful with restraining the neighboring countries from being trigger happy and imposing those restrictions. And that it doesn't do a great job of actually dissuading them from that approach. And so the reason why I bring all this up is because I think it's important context to understand just how significant is it that the WHO is the one who authorizes an emergency and authorizes the imposition of those restrictions. There's a little piece of me that feels that some of your story kind of like rests on this assumption that the rest of the states in the world are paying careful attention to what the WHO says is and is not allowed as a policy response. And that is what drives sort of your hypothesis about how the different costs and benefits that relatively more and less integrated states face before and after this reform. So my sort of suggestion for an extension or maybe another paper is to delve into that other cooperation problem that is going on, and to think about how this reform in 2005, which consisted of two things, it allows the WHO to formally act based on non-governmental sources of information, and it also empowers the WHO to declare that emergency. I'm just wondering if there is some aspect of that reform that actually changed the way that other states in the international community were reacting to WHO declarations. Maybe before the reform, other states in the world felt that the WHO was too toothless and they didn't pay attention to it, and so they ignored whatever the WHO authorized. But after the reform, they take it more seriously because they think that the WHO is going to do a better job of actually determining when bans are warranted, and so then they proceed with imposing those restrictions. Or they proceed with paying attention to the WHO's recommendations. So I just feel like that's a big part of your story that I don't see in the paper because there's not enough space for it, but I do think it might be relevant for your predictions. I'm having difficulty thinking it through far enough to figure out whether it actually, I think it might actually result in the opposite expectations of your hypotheses, which would be good news for you because then it's not an alternative explanation, but another reason why your result is puzzling. And so I think it warrants mention in the manuscript because I do think that that is a significant part of the strategic story present at the WHO. But moreover, I think it's just an opportunity for exploration in future work that is quite complementary to what you do, understanding perhaps how this reform could have also shaped the respect that other states have for the WHO's authorizations. So that was my main comment. As a minor note, I do think that in this manuscript, it might be worth engaging Worsnop a little bit more directly than you do. You cite her work in all of the relevant places, but I think you actually find something opposite of what she claims in her work, where she actually shows that the IHAR reform did not have the same or did not have any effect on the timeliness of outbreak states reporting decisions. She has a completely different model and operationalization, but because her work is so similar, and she might be a reviewer, you might want to engage that work a little bit more directly and illustrate what the difference in your argument is and why your empirical findings are different if you believe that they are. Okay. I have a handful of smaller comments and questions that you might consider. First, I thought that the use of the Gideon data was a real asset here. It tells me that you are thinking carefully about the sources of data and what they measure. And the idea behind using the Gideon data as a placebo here is that this is a less politicized source of information, and you're using the DONs to represent cooperation, but you also need to understand the severity of the disease. And I think in the way that you set it up, Gideon is a more like accurate representation of the disease burden. When you showed the descriptive statistics, however, I noticed that there is not a whole lot of variation over time in the Gideon data. And that did not match what my intuition would have been, which is that actually disease does vary over time. I am thinking about like the years where there has been a lot of disease outbreaks. I would expect that that we would see that in the Gideon data, and I didn't. And so I wonder if you could just add some more detail on what the reporting process is with Gideon. Are these like annual reports? Would we expect them to actually proxy for disease severity? And then the second thing I would suggest with respect to the Gideon data is, I'm not sure that using it as a placebo is really the best use of the Gideon data. I wonder if you should be controlling for the Gideon data if they indeed do measure or proxy for the presence of disease, so that you manage to sort of capture the fact that, like, yes, disease varies over time, but the DONs are going to then capture the sort of political cooperation element of that more than Gideon. There may be inferential problems with what I've just said. I just wanted to ask if maybe Gideon could be used as a control instead. Okay, I think the last question that I wanted to know is what role you think changes in the information environment could play in your story. So along the lines of, there's this whole exchange of information and the triggering of bans that might go on outside the WHO without its involvement. I do want to know whether over time you would expect it's easier to obtain information about outbreaks that are going on in other parts of the world that are not through the WHO. Because you have a difference in differences specification, that shouldn't necessarily hinder your results. But I do worry that the information environment could also interact with interconnectedness, because you might have more information about more interconnected places. And so I would just like you to sort of tease out and develop what kind of information exists outside of the WHO about disease that could also be leading states to, create the policies that they do. All in all, I think this is a really impressive project. I think it has a lot of promise. And I'm just really looking forward to seeing where it goes. Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. So Zoe, I'll turn the floor back over to you. So I'll let you give you a chance to respond to Lindsay's comments.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Lindsay, for the great comments. Yeah, these are great, actually. For the first part about the other cooperation problem, I did try to start to collect the data about border restrictions. And I do think it deserves a book chapter to really understand how the different countries impose border restrictions. What I find so far is that at least during COVID, from 2020 to 2021, if a country is highly integrated politically, this country is less likely to receive any types of border restriction. So it seems there is some heterogeneity that people are, even I am surprised to see that. So I think I want to look into different types of border restriction, because it's kind of interesting. Some countries do travel history bans. Some did citizenship ban. Some did just border closure to everyone. So I think that there might be some political issue underlying why different countries choosing different policy tools, and that helps understand where the border restrictions comes from. And in terms of what the WHO can do with the border restrictions, I think it's very sarcastic that the WHO was created to deal with this kind of border restrictions after disease outbreaks. It's not originally for health purpose. It's a way to deal with the cooperation problem with this kind of border restrictions. But turns out that the IHR reform only elicited more border restrictions. So I think that's actually interesting to see. And I think from the WHO's perspective, they understand very well they can do nothing with that. They always advise against the border restriction, but because they do not have any capacity to stop countries doing that. And there are strong domestic reasons, like it's just a very popular tool to use to make the domestic audience happy. So it's really, I think it's probably not within the WHO's capacity to change that. And I think in my book project, I want to have another chapter discussing how the WHO declared public health emergency of international concern. So during the Ebola outbreak, there is a huge delay, even in the second or third round of the Ebola outbreak. And when the Director General responded to why they delayed the response, the declaration, and he's kind of saying that the declaration is useless because it only triggers unnecessary border restrictions. So I think in that chapter, I will have an argument based on two functions the declaration has. One is the deterrence effect that this paper is about, but the other one is about the disease control effect. So I think the declaration the deterrence effect is only effective when the declaration is not made. So once you make the declaration, the WHO lost that side of the power. So I think it's a very political and diplomatic decision for the WHO to make. So I think that cooperation problem is unfortunately not solvable, I think, but we'll see how they want to reform this organization in the next round. Yeah, these are very important to discuss in the book project, and I think I also want to add more to the current script, the draft. For the second one, yeah, I think it's a good idea to engage more with WashNopp. Yeah, I will do that. For the Gideon data set, I did include the number of outbreaks as a control, and I do find a very strong positive coefficient estimate for that term. But since it's post-treatment variable, I didn't include it here. But I do like the idea that I should give more description about how the data is generated and why there's no variation. I think because that descriptive graph is based on cross-country total number of outbreaks. So maybe globalized wise, there's no variation, but for us, we might think 2009 and 2010 has huge outbreaks because of the swine fever, but it's because it's in the US and it's developed in these certain countries that make people feel certain years we see more disease outbreaks. While for Ebola, it's happening every several years, but they're quite invisible to the general public. So I guess this kind of visibility of diseases is actually another problem for the international community to deal with disease outbreaks and the vaccine development. So I think I will have a project about the vaccine to understand this kind of visibility problem. Information environment, yes, this is really a good alternative explanation that I cannot rule out now, because of course, China is back in 2003, the social media wasn't that developed, and now it's so popular that everyone can see what's going on in a small area in China. And if this kind of information problem is aligned with political ideology or other integration dimension, we will see the same result. So far, what I can only say is that after controlling for the effect of a country's transparency, which should at least tell us something about the information environment, we do see that countries who are less transparent disclose, and they are more likely to report after the reform. And controlling for that, the main integration result still holds. But it's very hard to test that. The WHO has the surveillance, that surveillance technology would be the ideal data set for me to use. I think that data set has daily reports, indicators, then I can see how do they respond to different outbreaks. But I emailed them very early on, and they said they didn't work with academia anymore. I think it's for some reason, but yeah, that's something I cannot rule out. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that I don't know how to solve yet. But I guess that's the best thing I can do for now. Yeah, that's all my response. I think they're all super helpful, and I want to add some of these to the current draft before sending it out.
Awesome. So we have about 20 minutes left. So I don't know if there's anything, Zoe, any other questions, like follow-up questions, or Lindsay, if you had any other sort of minor comments. I have a couple, this is pretty far outside my area of expertise. So I have a couple of sort of like ideas for other things that might be interesting with the model, but I'll let turn it back over to you two first to see if there's anything else.
I guess I just have a couple of ideas based on your responses, Zoe, which I think are very, helpful, and also signal just what a deep expert you are in this field, which I am also very far from. I do wonder with one test you might be able to run that hopefully would be pretty straightforward is just to demonstrate that when the WHO, or I guess when the WHO authorizes bans or restrictions, that we see an increase in the number of bans and restrictions that actually go into place. Because part of the original concern I was raising, right, is that like, well, the WHO doesn't seem to be that important if states are just going to do this anyway without listening to the WHO. So I think if you could show that that a WHO authorization does increase the number of bans and restrictions that go into place, even if, yes, states are flagrantly, doing this without the WHO's consent, just showing that relationship would actually do a lot to sort of mitigate that as sort of an alternative theory for what's going on here. So if you have the data on travel bans, then that should be pretty straightforward to show. And then the other, excuse me, the other idea that I just, another literature that you might connect to, because I think that this idea of looking at the process of the WHO actually determining whether it's a public health emergency is really fascinating. You can also connect, there's a big literature on disaster declarations. And my former colleague, Alicia Cooperman, has a really interesting paper on declaring drought in Northeast Brazil. And I'm sure that there's a really interesting research space for you to connect with there to look at the politics of when disasters get declared. And that could be also a really interesting opportunity to look for some of the like US dominance at the WHO, just to see if there seem to be any biases in like how long it takes to declare an emergency, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, for the first part, the Washnov, she has one paper about the swine fever, the other one about COVID, saying that once the WHO declared public health emergency, the international community imposed, there's a surge of ban imposition right after. So
then
I
you don't
think
have to do it.
that could, I really appreciate her
but
efforts.
Make the point, I think it'll be helpful.
Yeah, it's hard to do because you cannot do across country different diseases, and she actually collect the data manually for that disease across different countries. That there's a lot of effort that she did, so I really appreciate that. For the disease declaration, yes, that would be amazing. Actually, I didn't know this literature before, but I will engage with that. Oh, and related to that, the WHO is actually discussing some policy response to this kind of border restrictions. One of the policy option is that they create a layered declaration. So you have higher layer, second layer, third layer. But I think some public health experts, they are evaluating that policy idea and thinking it's not that useful. I think it's probably because of the political process it will be, and so that's one of the politics behind the border restriction. I think they are really working hard to figure out the way to deal with that. But some game theoretical model to see how the different layers kind of policy option would different from one signal. That would be something interesting to figure out in the future. Yeah, great.
So sort of following on that, so first I want to say, just to make sure that it's clear, I don't think you should make any changes to the model in the paper. Like, I think this is like a exemplary model for sort of how to use a very simple game theoretic model that makes a precise point and then take it to data. So the couple of ideas that I have, they're more like questions, about sort of things that might be interesting to think about in the future. I don't want you to interpret them as like, I don't think you should do either one of these in this paper. I just think these are sort of questions that they raise for me thinking about this theoretically. So the first question is, so in the model, when I read through, I was thinking about how to correctly interpret theta, right? So this is sort of like, the severity of the outbreak. And so, I think what I was, and you may want to do a little bit of writing in the paper to help clarify this, because I think people who read the formal model, it was uncertain, it was unclear to me sort of how I should think about this. Is it, should we take that as how bad the outbreak will become eventually? So I guess the model sort of lacks a dynamic component that to me seems like it's relevant for these kinds of situations, right? So the government is sort of trading off. It seems like, in reality, it seems like they might be trading off not like concealing it and hoping that the outbreak can be dealt with before it becomes a big problem where it's very obvious and something has to be done, right? And then that's clearly very bad for them. So is that how I should be thinking of theta? Or is it something, or should I think of it sort of, yeah, I guess that's sort of my question, is how should I interpret theta? Because it's clear sort of what it does in the utility functions, right? It's basically like the bigger theta is, the more mitigation that is going to benefit. But I guess how should I be thinking of it, given that there's that kind of dynamic component?
Yeah, that's a good point. So for the current paper, I don't have any test about the severity of diseases, and these are all incorporated by the country fixed effect, assuming that certain countries are more likely to get Ebola, and that this disease has this level of severity no matter when. So it doesn't capture, like, for some, like COVID is some disease that nobody knows what it is like until it become a global pandemic. So yeah, I don't have a good answer to how should we interpret theta in the empirical test. This is something I kind of hold as constant. And for the disease outbreak news, I think that the really good thing about that website, it's a daily operation routine activity that the WHO deal with every day. There's a lot of malaria, all kinds of diseases that may not be as sensitive as COVID. But even with those insensitive, maybe travel-related outbreaks, states still change their behavior with just the reporting. I think that's still something significant, especially if we are thinking about early stage of a disease outbreak, where nobody knows the characteristics of an outbreak, and they can just make a judgment of strong or severe or not. Then that's where early, like the decision to report is actually very important, because that affects information sharing and the research and all kinds of other things in the downstream. So I guess maybe if I say the model captures the early stage of disease outbreaks, can that help alleviate the concern of the dynamic the dynamic effect of the disease development, and the people learn about it and adjust to it?
Yeah, no, I think that's totally sufficient. And I do think you have, I mean, if I remember correctly, you have something like that in the paper. So I think that's, I don't think that's an issue for this paper. I just think it might be something interesting to think about in the future. And so my second sort of idea about the model, I think, is somewhat related to some of Lindsay's comments about how the international community is going to kind of like see this happen and act, independently, so I guess it would be interesting to think about an extension of the model where, and this is a question to you as an expert on this topic, it seems to me like another trade-off that the L player in the model faces, right? So they have this sort of stark decision because you're focusing on information, which again, like this is totally fine, like you shouldn't change this model for this paper. But it seems like in reality, they have they can also do something about it, right? So they can themselves take these mitigation steps. And you mentioned in the paper, we're sort of thinking about these early stages, but then I wonder, so it seems like an important part of this sort of strategic interaction is that the more mitigation steps are taken by the government, that can act as a verifiable signal to the WHO or someone of the severity of the outbreak, right? And so an interesting result that I suspect would be true in like a reasonable model is that I think this, if you built that into this kind of setup, I think what you're going to get in equilibrium is like under provision of domestic mitigation, right? Because if there's a trade-off and the leader is thinking, okay, well, I could sort of, the ideal level subject to no concerns about information and the response of the international community, the ideal level of mitigation domestically would be at this level. It'd be quite high. But then if I know that those mitigation efforts are going to trigger a response from the international community, I might want to risk, right? I might want to risk that a lower level of mitigation will get a lid on the outbreak before it becomes too big of a problem, right? And so that would be sort of an interesting result, I think, if you could get it. Again, I don't know if that's a realistic kind of thing to think about leaders doing, but it seems plausible. I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's actually super relevant. So the way the WHO deal with outbreaks, one is surveil, that's like a after emergency kind of management, but there's also pre-emergency preparedness. So one of the key change in the requirement in the IHR reform is that it requires countries to build some capacity, and the country has to report to the WHO about their capacity building. And this was originally part of the book project that I want to include. Then I realized I've got already enough, so this will be a separate paper. And what I was thinking about this issue is that it's actually not a good idea for leaders to invest in capacity building, because you prevented all the disease, you cannot claim credit. And I think what the WHO did, I think it's smart, but I don't know how it's actually working, is that it asked the states to report their compliance index. And then there's an external team that a third party is going to evaluate how good each country are doing on that front. So that creates a platform where leaders can use the WHO to claim credit for what they did that cannot be seen. So based on a quick look at the data, I don't know how this system works really, because El Salvador has 100 index across years. It's impossible. While Canada has 94, 95. So I don't know how, this is something I do want to do in the future. And regarding your argument about the mitigation effort, and this is actually really cool because it suggests that if my argument is right, countries who are isolated, they want to invest more, while countries who are integrated like US and Canada, they are less willing to invest in the capacity building. So, but I think it's probably the opposite. At least the US and Canada has so much investment in the this preparedness, and even the surveillance system is built by the Canadian government. So I think something is wrong with if this is included as part of state strategic interaction. But I think it's really, it's a very entertaining idea to think what went wrong and figure out why. If that's part of the story, we will see something opposite to the real world. But I don't have
there must be
now.
something missing, right? If the pattern is actually empirically the opposite of that. That would be an interesting thing to look at, and sort of like why that model is not right.
I think it should be related to the domestic accountability problem. Maybe the democracy are better able to claim credit for things that are prevented because of those shark attacks, natural disaster papers. So maybe this thing is democracy, non-democracy cleavage rather than an integration problem, integration cleavage. I think it's a very interesting idea to think more. yeah, that's another thing I want to do in the future.
Lots of interesting stuff in this project.
Yeah.
So we're getting sort of close to time. So are there any other sort of like collect anything that's lingering out there? Zoe, do you have any follow-up questions for any of the feedback from Lindsay? Lindsay, was there anything else that you sort of wanted to mention or anything like that?
Not for me.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a super engaging discussion, and it's actually super interesting, and it touches a lot of about how to deal with outbreaks. It's actually there's like multiple layers of politics problem behind the outbreaks. So I'm very enjoying the discussion, and thank you, Brad, for organizing this public goods and making it available to everyone. I really appreciate all the efforts. I know how hard it is to do workshops after pandemic.
That's right. You organized the grad student IPE this semester, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard, and especially if you are inviting discussant, that's even more difficult. So I really appreciate this great public service.
Well, thanks for the kind words, Zoe. Well, with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks, Zoe, for the awesome paper. I look forward to seeing it out and seeing the book. And Lindsay, thanks as always for the great comments. Careful read of the paper.
Thank you. This is definitely a fun paper to discuss. So yeah, thanks for sharing it with us, Zoe.
All right, thanks everybody. This is our last session for the spring. So look out for the call for papers for the OPSC in the fall of 2023. See you next time.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Take care.